G'day team, Jeremy Britton reporting live from the Gili Islands, beautiful tropical blue waters and overcast skies today. Having a wonderful time here. It's the first time Evie and I have taken a week off in about 5 years. We normally have Wednesday weekend and we have weekends off, so we only normally work 2 days in a row and then take a break, but it's a long time since we've had many days off in a row. So this is quite nice, beautiful place. You don't have to have the lifestyles of the rich and famous in order to come here. So big shout out to Gili Cat, who brought us over for, it was $70 for a return ticket, and then the place that we're staying in is about $30, $35 a night to stay here in a beautiful bungalow with air conditioning. And it's about being smart, managing your money wisely, and you can have wonderful deals and you can stay in amazing places and do incredible things. You don't have to have millions of dollars, and you don't necessarily have to pay $2,000 a night at the Maldives to have such beautiful scenery. Speaking of managing your money very well, an Australian guy who managed his money very well is multi-billionaire Kerry Packer. And Kerry Packer obviously built a huge big empire. And apart from being Australia's richest man at the time, he was also very famous for paying $30 in tax one year. And the Australian Taxation Office took him to court and said that he was evading tax, and he said, no, evading tax is illegal. I'm actually avoiding tax and minimising tax, which is very legal. And the reason he didn't want to actually pay any taxes to the Australian government is because, in his words, they weren't doing a good job of spending it. Around about 70% of the money that goes into taxation is, I would argue, wasted. About 30% returns back into social services and things that are good for the community. So if you're paying 30% tax, around 1/3 of that is actually coming back to you in the form of doing things for the general public, which is around about 10%. There's many people who also tithe on their money. If they belong to a particular religion, you might give 10% of your income away to help the community. And that's something that was around for a long time before tax was. So it's interesting, it's around about the same ratio that goes back into the community. Most people alive today think that tax has always been there. The Australian Taxation Office started off in 1915. The IRS started off in the US in 1913, both about the time of the Great War. And the Australian Tax Office, they started off because it was to fund the war effort. Up until 1915, Australia had been around for about 150 years and there was no income tax. There was just a duties tax on goods and excises, sort of similar to the GST, but there was no income tax. That was to come in to pay for the war. And once the war was over, it was supposed to be gotten rid of. But of course, once all the income tax started coming in, they need people to manage it, they need people to look after it, they needed accountants and administrators and that sort of stuff. So there was a huge crew of people looking after all of this money. And of course, once the war was over, none of these guys wanted to lose their jobs, none of the politicians wanted to lose that money. So income tax has stayed in, even though the First World War ended a century ago. It's very interesting when you look back at the legislation and how people like Kerry Packer are able to get around that. Paying tax to the Australian Tax Office is not mandatory, it's optional, it is voluntary. Similar to the Australian Electoral Commission, the Australian Electoral Commission and the Australian Taxation Office are not government departments. We do have a Defence Department, we have the Department of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs, we have the Immigration Department, we have the Social Security Department, but we do not have Tax Department. Google it, check it out if you don't believe me. The Australian Taxation Office and the Australian Electoral Commission are both privately owned private corporations. You've probably signed a contract with them. When you were 17, 18, someone told you you have to enrol to vote, and you went and signed a contract with the AEC, and then if you fail to vote, you've breached the contract and they can actually fine you. Similar thing with the Taxation Office. Somebody told you have to go and register for a tax file number and do this and do that. And if you've got a company, you've got to apply for an ABN and an ACN. And yeah, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Maybe it's just custom, maybe it's just what everybody does. Because if you know anybody who hasn't enrolled to vote, you can live as an Australian citizen for 50 years. If you don't enrol to vote, then you don't vote and you don't get fined because you never breached the contract. And the initial contract is voluntary. This is what they don't tell you. So you make the comparison again between the Australian Electoral Commission and the Australian Taxation Office, both private corporations, both privately owned, not government departments, and you've probably signed a contract with them. The question is, how do you get out of that contract? How do you still live in the real world and still operate and get to manage your money effectively? Kerry Packer was a very generous man, gave away a lot of money, didn't pay all of it to the tax department because he thought he could better manage it himself, which I'd argue he probably could. He was very successful financially. Just a tip for you, manage your money well, take a nice holiday, enjoy the scenery wherever you happen to be. There's plenty of nice places you can stay. There's some places you can stay on Airbnb, even in Australia or in America, for $25, $30 a night. If you want to talk about opting out of the system and say, hey, I don't want to vote, I don't like politicians, or I don't want to pay tax, that's also achievable. A lot of people are going to be upset by what I'm saying who's going to pay for the roads and the hospitals and the schools and that sort of stuff. Well, those things existed for 150 years in Australia before we had income tax. So think about where the money comes from. It doesn't come from where you think it comes from. And managing your money should be a thing. If you want to give money to the government, absolutely, you can do that. But it's nice to have a choice. Talk to you soon.